Behind the great dams of America lie the reservoirs, the vast artificial lakes that store the water on which the nation depends. And for generations they have seemed as permanent as the mountains themselves, enormous bodies of water holding back the very promise of a reliable supply. But something is happening to them, something that has begun to alarm the scientists, the engineers, and the officials who watch them, because the water behind America's biggest dams is disappearing. The great reservoirs are falling, their surfaces dropping year after year, their shorelines retreating, their once full basins exposing rings of bare rock and stretches of dry ground where water used to be. These reservoirs store the water that supplies the taps of tens of millions of people, that irrigates the farms that feed the nation, and that spins the great turbines generating the electricity that lights whole regions. And as the water behind the dams disappears, all of this comes into question. This is the story of the disappearing water behind America's biggest dams, of why it is happening, of what it means, and of what could be done about it. Before we begin, one honest word. To say the water is disappearing does not mean the reservoirs will vanish entirely, or that catastrophe is certain. It means these vital reserves are shrinking to a degree that threatens the systems built upon them, and that understanding why is the first step toward protecting all that depends on them. Quick honest word before we dive in. A lot of people watch these all the way through, love them, and forget the one small thing that keeps a channel like ours going, hitting subscribe. If you are finding this important, take 1 second and subscribe right now. It genuinely matters for us and costs you nothing. And drop your state in the comments so we can see who is watching. Alright, let's begin. What the reservoirs do and why they matter to understand why the disappearing water is so serious. You first have to understand what the reservoirs behind the great dams actually do, because they are far more than scenic lakes. A reservoir is a store of water held back by a dam so that it can be released in a controlled way when it is needed. This storage is the whole point, because the rivers that feed the reservoirs do not flow evenly through the year or from one year to the next, but rise and fall with the seasons and the weather, and without a way to store the water, the supply would be as unreliable as the rivers themselves. The reservoirs smooth out this variability, holding water in the wet times to release it in the dry ones, so that the cities and farms that depend on them can count on a steady supply even when the rivers run low. This is why the reservoirs are often called the savings accounts of the nation's water, because they hold the reserves that carry a region through the dry years. When the reservoirs are full, they can absorb a drought, releasing their stored water to make up for the shortfall. But when they are low, there is little to fall back upon. The great reservoirs behind America's biggest dams were built to hold enormous reserves, several years' worth of a river's flow, precisely so that they could protect against even prolonged dry spells. And this is what makes the disappearing water so alarming, because as the reservoirs fall, the reserves that protect against shortage are being depleted, the savings drawn down, and the buffer that has long kept the water flowing reliably is shrinking. Understanding what the reservoirs do and why their reserves matter so much is the key to understanding why their decline is such a serious concern. Why the water is disappearing. So why is the water behind the great dams disappearing? The answer lies in a simple but relentless imbalance between the water flowing into the reservoirs and the water going out. On the inflow side, the water that feeds the reservoirs has been diminishing. A prolonged drought has reduced the rain and the snow that feed the rivers, so that less water flows into the reservoirs. And this drought has persisted for years, refusing to break. Layered on top of the drought is the warming of the climate, which reduces the water in several ways, diminishing the mountain snowpack that feeds so many rivers, causing more of the snow to evaporate before it can melt, drying the soils so they absorb more of the runoff, and lifting more water directly from the surfaces of the reservoirs through evaporation. Together, the drought and the warming have reduced the water flowing into the reservoirs, in some cases dramatically. On the outflow side, the demand for water has grown. As populations have expanded and farms have drawn more water has been taken from the reservoirs. In many cases, more than the rivers can sustainably provide. When more water is taken out than flows in, a reservoir falls, and this is precisely what has been happening. The reservoirs were filled in wetter times, and for years they could make up the difference between the shrinking supply and the growing demand, drawing down the stored water to keep everyone supplied. But a reservoir can only cover the gap for so long, and as the years of drought and overuse have accumulated, the reserves have been steadily depleted, the water disappearing faster than it can be replaced. This is why the water behind the great dams is disappearing, because for years the region has been taking more than the rivers provide, drawing down the reserves until the imbalance can no longer be hidden. Here is something I would genuinely love to know, and it takes 10 seconds. Did you have any idea that the great reservoirs behind America's dams have been drawn down so far? Drop a yes or no in the comments, because your answers help us understand what surprises people most, and I read every reply. Okay, back to it. The great reservoirs, at the heart of it all, the clearest and most dramatic examples of the disappearing water, are found in the two great reservoirs of the Colorado River, the largest in the country, which store the water that sustains tens of millions of people across the Southwest. These enormous reservoirs, held back by two of the greatest dams ever built, were designed to hold years of the river's flow, a vast reserve against the dry times, and for much of their history, they were kept relatively full. But the sustained decline of the Colorado has drawn them down to historic lows, and they have become the leading symbols of the disappearing water, their falling levels watched with anxiety across the region and the nation. Together, these two reservoirs hold the great buffer that protects the Southwest against shortage, and their decline represents the draining of that buffer. As they have fallen, they have approached the thresholds at which their dams can no longer generate power, and below that, the levels at which water can no longer pass through at all. The two reservoirs are managed together, water released from the upper one to sustain the lower, so that their fates are intertwined, and both have fallen far below their capacity as the crisis has deepened. These great reservoirs are the heart of the story of the disappearing water, the place where the crisis is most advanced and most consequential. And they stand as a warning of what can happen to the water behind even the greatest of dams when the river that feeds them runs low year after year. The signs written on the canyon walls. The disappearance of the water behind the great dams is not an abstract matter of statistics, but a visible reality, written across the landscape in signs that anyone can see. The most famous of these is the Great Pale Ring that now encircles the falling reservoirs, the bleached band of rock along the shorelines that marks how far the water has dropped. This ring, often called a bathtub ring, is a direct physical record of the disappearance, a line drawn across the canyon walls showing where the water used to be, and as the water has continued to fall, the ring has grown taller and more dramatic, a widening band of bare stone that speaks silently but powerfully of how much water has been lost. The bathtub ring has become a symbol of the crisis precisely because it is so easy to see and so hard to misunderstand, a visual measure that makes the abstract numbers of the falling water levels real and tangible. But it is only one of the visible signs. Around the shrinking reservoirs, boat ramps and marinas that once sat at the water's edge have been left stranded far from the retreating shore, forced to relocate or close. The falling water has even uncovered features and objects long hidden beneath the surface, eerie revelations that have captured public attention and driven home the scale of what is being lost. These visible signs are the proof of the disappearance, the physical evidence that the water is truly vanishing, and they are a powerful reminder that this is not a distant or hypothetical problem, but one that is reshaping the landscape before our eyes. The great reservoirs shrinking in plain sight and leaving their marks on the canyon walls for all to see. There is something profound in these visible signs, because they turn an abstract crisis, measured in charts and forecasts, into something a person can stand before and grasp with their own eyes. To see the pale ring towering high above the water, to see the marinas stranded on dry ground where boats once floated, is to understand in an instant how far the water has fallen. These images have done more than any statistic to bring home the reality of the disappearing water, a constant, silent warning of the scale of the crisis unfolding behind the great dams. The power that is slipping away as the water behind the great dams disappears, one of the first things to be lost is the electricity that the dams generate. Because the great dams are not only reservoirs, but power plants, and their ability to generate power depends on the water behind them. A hydroelectric dam produces electricity by letting water fall through its turbines, and the amount of power it can generate depends on the level of the reservoir, because the higher the water and the greater the pressure driving the turbines, the more electricity the dam produces. As the reservoirs have fallen, the power the dams generate has declined, and if the water were to fall below the level of the intakes that feed the turbines, the dams would stop generating power altogether. This loss of power is a serious matter because the dams have long provided clean, reliable electricity to whole regions. Power valued precisely because it is produced without burning any fuel. As this power slips away with the disappearing water, the regions that depend on it must make up the difference from other sources, often ones that are more expensive or that burn fossil fuels, at a time when the demand for electricity is growing and the pressure to reduce emissions is intense. The threat to the power is one of the clearest consequences of the disappearing water, a reminder that the great dams provide not only the water that sustains the region, but the electricity that helps power it, and that as the water vanishes, both are put at risk. The power slipping away from the great dams is a quiet but significant loss, felt across the grids that depend on it. And it is one of the first signs of how much the disappearing water threatens. Quick pause, because this matters and deserves to be seen. If you are getting value from this, tap the like button. It really does help the video reach more people. And if you have family or friends who care about where their water and power come from, share this with them, because it is genuinely important to understand. One like, one share to someone you care about. And let's keep going. The deeper threat to the water itself. Beyond the loss of power lies a deeper and more serious threat, the threat to the water supply itself, because the reservoirs are not only sources of power, but stores of the water that sustain cities and farms. And as the water disappears, this most fundamental function is put at risk. The reservoirs behind the great dams supply the water that flows to the taps of tens of millions of people and that irrigates the vast farms of entire regions. And this water supply function is, if anything, even more essential than the power. As the reservoirs fall, the water available to be delivered diminishes, forcing reductions in the supply to the users who depend on it. And in systems where shortages have been declared, the users must cut back on the water they take. The deepest danger of all is that if a reservoir were to fall to the very lowest levels, there is the threat that water could no longer be passed through the dam at all, a scenario sometimes called dead pool, in which the reservoir becomes a trap holding its remaining water behind the concrete with no way to release it downstream. This would be catastrophic, cutting off the supply entirely to everyone below the dam, and it is the specter of this outcome that gives the disappearing water its greatest urgency. While a loss of power can be made up, however imperfectly, from other sources, there is no easy substitute for the water itself in the arid regions that depend on these reservoirs. The threat to the water supply is thus the most serious consequence of the disappearing water, reaching into the most basic needs of the people and the farms that depend on the great dams, and it is the reason the falling reservoirs are watched with such anxiety, because the water they hold is, quite literally, the lifeblood of the regions they serve. The ripples that spread outward, the disappearance of the water behind the great dams, does not stay contained, but ripples outward, reaching into the food supply, the economy, and the lives of people far from the reservoirs themselves. A great deal of the water stored behind the dams goes to agriculture, to the farms that produce an enormous share of the nation's food. And as the water disappears and the supply for irrigation is reduced, farmers are forced to cut back, fallowing fields and reducing production, so that the disappearing water reaches into the food supply of the entire nation, touching the tables of people who have never seen the reservoirs and could not point to them on a map. The reduction of the water thus becomes a reduction in the food the water grows, a ripple that spreads across the country. Beyond food, the disappearing water ripples through the economy in many ways. The loss of cheap hydroelectric power can raise energy costs. The reductions in water supply can constrain the growth and activity of cities and industries. And the regions most affected can face real economic hardship as their water and power become less reliable and more expensive. The cost of coping with the crisis, of building new infrastructure and finding new sources, adds to the burden. And the uncertainty about the future of the water can weigh on the confidence of the people and the businesses that depend on it. The disappearing water is thus not a narrow or localized problem, but one whose effects spread outward through the interconnected systems of the modern economy, touching the cost of food, the price of energy, and the vitality of entire regions. Understanding these ripples helps to reveal just how much depends on the water behind the great dams, and how far the consequences reach when that water disappears. Can the water come back? A natural question, given all this, is whether the water can come back, whether the reservoirs can refill and the crisis ease, and the answer is complicated and uncertain. In the short term, the reservoirs can rise as well as fall, and a wet year with abundant snow can push them back up, buying time and easing the immediate pressure. The reservoirs are not doomed to fall forever, and there have been years when good snowfall has brought welcome relief, refilling the reservoirs somewhat and pulling them back from the brink. This variability is real, and it means that the disappearance of the water is not a steady, unbroken decline, but a trend punctuated by ups and downs. But the deeper question is whether the water can come back for good, whether the reservoirs can return to the full levels of the past, and here the answer is far less hopeful, because the underlying forces driving the decline, especially the warming of the climate, are not going away. The warming is expected to continue, reducing the flow of the rivers over the long term regardless of the year-to-year swings, and this means that the region cannot count on the reservoirs returning to their former abundance. Some scientists describe the situation not as a temporary drought that will end, but as a lasting shift toward a drier climate, a fundamental reduction in the water the rivers can be expected to carry. If this is so, then the disappearing water may not fully come back, and the region must plan not for a return to the old abundance, but for a future of less. The water may rise and fall with the wet and dry years, but the long-term trend, driven by the warming climate, points toward a diminished supply, and this is the sobering reality behind the question of whether the water can come back. Alright, I know, second time I am bringing this up, feel free to sigh at me, but quickly, if you have made it this deep into a video about America's dams, you clearly care about this stuff, and a lot of you who watch have not subscribed yet. That one tap genuinely tips the scales for a small channel like ours. No guilt, just a grateful ask. That is the last time, promise. Let's finish. What can be done about the disappearing water faced with the disappearing water behind the great dams? The nation is not without options, and there is a great deal that can be done to slow the decline and to protect what depends on the reservoirs. The most fundamental response is to address the imbalance between the water flowing in and the water going out. And since the inflow is largely beyond human control, the key is to reduce the outflow, the demand for water, through conservation and greater efficiency. Cities and farms across the affected regions have been working to use water more efficiently, to reduce waste, and to bring their consumption more in line with the reality of a diminished supply. And every drop saved is a drop that helps keep the reservoirs higher and the water flowing. Beyond conservation, there is the careful management of the reservoirs and the rivers that feed them, coordinating their operation to preserve their levels and their functions. And there are agreements among the states and users who share the water to reduce their use and to keep the reservoirs from falling to catastrophic levels. There is the diversification of water and power sources, reducing the dependence on the vulnerable reservoirs by developing other supplies, such as the recycling and reuse of water, and other sources of clean electricity. And there is the broader effort to address the warming climate that drives the long-term decline. None of these responses is a complete solution on its own, but together they offer a genuine path towards slowing the disappearance of the water and adapting to the new reality of less. The water behind the great dams is disappearing, and the systems built upon it are at risk, but the future is not yet written, and the actions taken now, to conserve, to manage, to diversify, and to adapt, will determine whether the nation can protect the water and the power the great dams provide. The disappearing water is a serious warning, but it is also a call to action, a reminder that the reserves protecting the nation's water are shrinking, and that the time to act, to safeguard these vital waters before they disappear beyond